The world is not falling apart. It is losing its center. Not with explosions, but with hesitation. A U.S. president turns pressure inward. An ally begins to doubt. And Greenland, remote, frozen, forgotten, suddenly becomes a crack in the global order. This is not a territorial dispute. It is a test of belief. For 8 decades, one assumption held the West together: that America would defend Europe. Not conditionally, not selectively, but instinctively. Now, that instinct is questioned. From Moscow, this looks like history bending in Russia's favor. Because Russia never needed NATO to fall, only to hesitate. Yet power is never that obedient. Because the same disruption unsettling Europe is also blocking Russia's designs in Ukraine and beyond. This is the paradox of modern power. Unstable, unpredictable, self-contradictory. If you want to understand how today's world is really changing, not headlines but hidden mechanics, stay with me. Because before we talk about Russia or Greenland, we must first confront the deeper question beneath them both. What appears to be a sudden crisis is actually the exposure of something fragile. The transatlantic system was never built on affection. It was built on reliability. Europe aligned its security, its diplomacy, its strategic patience around one constant: that the United States would anchor the system. This was not written into treaties alone. It lived in habits, expectations, reflexes formed over decades. When that reflex weakens, everything else starts to wobble. Defense plans stall, political unity thins, strategic confidence erodes. This is why Greenland matters far beyond its geography. It forces allies to imagine a future where American support is negotiable. From Russia's perspective, this is not about conquest. It is about atmosphere, a climate where doubt circulates freely, where unity requires constant reassurance. But doubt is a volatile weapon. It spreads quickly, and it rarely obeys the hand that releases it. To understand how we arrived at this moment of uncertainty, we need to trace the longer historical current that shaped it. This tension did not begin with Donald Trump. It was waiting for him. After the Cold War, the Atlantic system entered a long illusion. That power had become predictable, that alliances were permanent, that history had slurred down. NATO expanded. Europe downsized its military reflexes. Security became outsourced. Russia watched and learned. For decades, Moscow tested the system. Diplomatically, economically, militarily, each test asked the same question: how much strain can this alliance absorb before it bends? The answer was always unclear. Over time, certainty was replaced by procedure, commitments by consultations, instinct by debate. Then came a moment when the system met a leader who did not treat alliances as sacred, but as transactional. Trump did not create the cracks. He revealed them, and once revealed, they could no longer be ignored. With that historical pressure in place, the first real shock was only a matter of timing. The first shock did not arrive with gunfire. It arrived with disbelief. A public confrontation between the United States and a NATO ally over Greenland, something once unthinkable, suddenly became real. Not as policy, but as pressure. In Europe, the reaction was not panic. It was something worse: confusion. Because when the threat comes from within the alliance, there is no playbook. Governments debated quietly. Commentators spoke carefully. And beneath it all, a single question echoed: if this can happen here, where else can it happen next? From Moscow, the moment looked almost surreal. A strategic objective pursued for generations, appearing without confrontation. No tanks, no ultimatums, just tension between partners. This is how systems destabilize, not through collapse, but through internal strain. If you're trying to understand why modern power feels different, why influence today often looks indirect, this moment matters. But to grasp its true significance, we have to look at the machinery beneath the surface. What matters most in geopolitics is rarely what is said out loud. It is what changes behavior quietly. The hidden mechanism at work here is not territory, not even alliances. It is expectation management. For decades, NATO functioned less as a military machine and more as a psychological one. Its greatest weapon was certainty. Russia never needed to defeat NATO militarily. It only needed to make allies question whether help would arrive on time. Trump's disruption introduced that uncertainty, not through withdrawal, but through ambiguity. Every statement became conditional. Every guarantee sounded negotiable. For Europe, this forced hesitation. For Russia, it opened space. But ambiguity is unstable leverage because it cuts in multiple directions. The same uncertainty that weakens alliances also complicates adversaries' planning. Moscow cannot fully trust the opening it sees because unpredictability cannot be controlled. What looks like advantage is also risk. And when risk collides with reality, systems are tested by a second shock. The second shock came quietly, but its impact was broader. Russia expected momentum, a fast deal, a favorable end to the Ukraine war. That did not happen. Instead, negotiations slowed. Europe inserted itself. Pressure fragmented. From Moscow's perspective, this was not strategy. It was friction. At the same time, U.S. actions cut into Russian influence elsewhere. In the Middle East, in the Caucasus, in Venezuela. Not always loudly, but decisively. The pattern was confusing. Accommodation in tone, resistance in action. For the Kremlin, this created a strategic dilemma. How do you plan when the signal keeps changing? Unpredictability is useful only when it serves your design. Here, it didn't. Russia gained distraction, but lost clarity. And in geopolitics, clarity is power. The consequences of this confusion do not stay at the level of states. They travel downward to ordinary people. And this is where the story reaches you. Because when great powers hesitate, the cost is never abstract. It shows up in prices, in energy bills, in uncertainty about the future. When alliances wobble, markets feel it first. Confidence drains quietly. Investment pauses. Governments delay decisions that affect daily life. You may not follow Greenland. You may not care about NATO debates, but you feel the consequences. When leaders signal doubt, systems slow down. And when systems slow down, ordinary people pay the price. Not because of ideology, but because stability is invisible until it disappears. If you've ever wondered why the world feels less predictable, why everything seems more fragile, this is part of the answer. Pay attention to moments like this, because they shape the ground beneath you long before headlines catch up. And what happens next does not stop at Europe's borders. It spreads outward, globally. When the Atlantic center wobbles, the shock does not stay contained. Other powers watch closely. Not what is declared, but what is tolerated. In Asia, uncertainty recalibrates risk. In the Middle East, influence shifts faster. In Latin America, alignment becomes transactional. Everywhere, the same calculation emerges. Is the old order still reliable? For Russia, the benefit is indirect. Western focus fragments, attention splinters. Unity requires more effort to maintain. But the larger effect is systemic, because once one alliance shows strain, others begin to hedge. Security becomes conditional. Partnerships become flexible. Commitments shorten. And into that space, new actors step forward. Not always to challenge, sometimes simply to test. This is how global instability spreads. Not through conquest, but through imitation. What begins as a dispute in the Arctic ends as a question mark hanging over the entire international system. With the system unsettled, the future no longer follows a single path. It splits into scenarios. From here, the future does not move forward, it branches. The first path is stabilization. Allies adapt. Europe reinforces its role. The alliance absorbs uncertainty and recalibrates. In this scenario, disruption becomes a warning, not a fracture. The system bends, but holds. The second path is managed drift. No collapse, no renewal. Doubt lingers. Coordination slows. Unity survives, but thinner, weaker, more conditional. Russia gains space, just room to maneuver. And then there is the third path, the dangerous one. Uncertainty compounds. Transactional thinking hardens. Alliances become temporary arrangements. In this world, deterrence weakens quietly. Misjudgments multiply. And stability erodes without a single dramatic moment. History rarely announces which path it chooses. It reveals it gradually. What decides the outcome is not intention, but consistency. And that brings us to the final question, what this moment ultimately teaches us. Power today does not announce itself with conquest. It signals itself through reliability. The lesson of this moment is simple, but uncomfortable. Alliances do not collapse when they are attacked. They collapse when they are doubted. Russia understands this. So does China. So does every state watching quietly from the sidelines. What makes this era dangerous is not aggression. It is inconsistency. When guarantees feel conditional, the system begins to drift. And drift is how order dissolves. This story is not over, because uncertainty feeds on itself. The choices made now, in tone, in pressure, in predictability, will shape whether this disruption becomes a correction or a fracture. If you want to understand what comes next, you must stop watching headlines and start watching patterns. Because the future of power will not be decided by one leader or one crisis, but by whether trust can survive disruption. Stay with me, because the next chapter is already forming.